Hi guys, welcome back to the pit. In today's video, I'm going to show you how I built these gravel roads for my Normandy bolt action table. And before we begin, if you like my work and want to support it, please like the video and subscribe to my channel. It's a huge help. Thank you. This video is going to function as both a tutorial on my roads building technique, as well as a progress update on my larger bougie bolt action table. If you're interested in my overall Normandy project, stick around to the second half of the video, as I've made some major changes. And you do not want to miss this. And now, onto the roads. In my first video, I gave the roads a black undercoat, as I was planning to use AK Terrain's asphalt to create the road's surface. However, when looking at the bougie aerial photos, I finally noticed how light the roads appear, as well as what looks like dust being cast off the roads. And then a quick Google search confirmed it. The majority of roads in Normandy during World War II were unsealed and were built of crushed, packed gravel, and not asphalt. So I gave all the roads a light brown undercoat and looked through historical photos for inspiration, and decided that I wanted to create something like what is depicted in these historic photos. And then I got building. I start by creating the roadside curbs. To build these, I use 1.5 by 2mm evergreen styrene strips. I cut up several strips into 3cm lengths, and file down any sharp edges. I then glue these down along the edges of selected sections of road, focusing on the center of the board. I create rounded corners of the curb by cutting strips much shorter and at 45-degree angles. Once the glue is dry, I use a file and hobby knife to clean up the excess glue around the strips. Then it was time to paint the curbs. First, I masked up the board around the curbs. I then primed them, and gave them a coat of light grey paint. Once that was done, I removed the tape and painted random sections of the curb a darker shade of grey. Followed by a dark wash. And then I dabbed all the curbs with light grey paint and a rough piece of sponge to create the concrete look. As these curbs are going to take a beating during wargaming, I gave them a coat of matte varnish before calling them done. Then, using AK Terrain's light earth, I created the road surfaces. I applied this very thinly onto the cork sheets using a small clay trowel. It's very important to apply this as thinly as possible, otherwise cracks will form once it's dry. I also use a wet brush to clean the light earth off the curbs. On the sections of rough road, I create tyre grooves by running a toy car with wet wheels down the trail several times. I then apply some fine ballast to the middle and edges of the rough road and fix them down using a brush while the textured paint is still wet. I go over all the roads with a brush while the light earth is still wet to create some texture. Just a note, let the textured paint set for at least a day to ensure that cracks don't form. If they do form, just apply another thin layer to fill in those cracks, which seems to solve the issue. Once the light earth is dry, and I was happy that cracking was minimal, I moved on to weathering the roads. Looking at pictures of Normandy roads during that time, many of which have been colorized after the fact, I'm aware, you can see that they are depicted as being quite dusty and light in color, with darker local soil on the road's edges, creating a kind of light to dark color gradient into their centers. To create this effect, I mix European earth pigment, water, and PVA glue to create a wash, which I then apply to the edges of all the roads, and then feather into the center, recreating this color gradient. Then with a dry paper towel, I lightly dab the center of the roads to create a highlight. While the wash is still wet, I sprinkled down some fine leaf litter onto the road's edges and then fixed it down using more of the same wash. Finally, I used desert dust pigment to create the light dusty center of the roads. I applied this dry and fan it out and blend it in using a rough brush. For the rough side road, I applied the pigment into the wheel tracks. And after this, I called the roads done. Now, onto the project update. If you've watched my first video on this project, you'll know that I've based my table on a real town in Normandy called Bougie. And I built the base of this table using 4 identical MDF sheets with 4 foam blocks glued on top, which were later carved into the shape of the terrain. 2 of the foam blocks contain sections of the table I attempted to build years ago. However, my standards have shot up since I built these sections, so I decided to scrap them and start over. They're currently sitting in landfill. It was a very difficult decision. I replaced these 2 sections with a single foam block, also with an MDF base, that was 60 cm wide and 120 cm long. This section contains the ends of Rue de la Plaine and Rue de l'Église. So I first took the MDF board and using liquid nails glued down the foam block on top of it. Once that was set, I ruled out the positions of the roads, ensuring that they lined up perfectly with the other boards. From the aerial photos taken during World War II, you can see that there were 2 large fields enclosed by hedgerows running along Rue de la Plaine. So my next step was to create the base of these hedgerows. I first drew the outlines of these hedgerows, ensuring that they were around 3 to 4 centimeters wide, making sure that I left gaps for entrances. Then with the Stanley knife, I cut out the hedgerows' foundations, creating V-shaped trenches. Next, I used expanding foam and filled each trench with a line of it, and allowed it to expand. And once that was set, I used the same Stanley knife to cut the foam cleanly at the board's edges. And also carve the foam into a realistic mound shape where necessary. I then took 2 rolls of thin cork sheet, cut them 8 cm wide, and glued them down into place using liquid nails. Then, using gap filler, I shaped the hedgerow mounds and road shoulders. Once that was all dry, I gave the board a coat of brown paint, with lighter brown for the roads. And that was the new section of board done. Of course, I added the road details after this. Thank you very much for watching, guys, and please remember to like and subscribe.